Welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this plenary session, the third and final plenary session on culture, conduct and consumers, navigating change in financial services. And to my left, we have Liam Mason, Director of Regulation at the Financial Markets Authority. Just wave as we go. Susan Taylor, Chief Executive Officer of Financial Services Complaints Limited. James Hartley, Head of Financial Markets Policy at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. David Ireland, Partner at Kensington Swan and Special Advisor to the Code Working Group. And Richard Clippen, our Chief Executive Officer at both FSC and Workplace Savings NZ. I'll stay here at the lectern because if I sit down I'll flake out. So I really want to welcome our esteemed and thought-leading panel to whom we're most grateful, and none of whom are shrinking violets. So we look forward to a good discussion. In terms of how we're running things, I'll be asking questions of or inviting comments from one panellist at a time, giving them a few minutes to reply, and then asking follow-up questions, either of them or of others as appropriate. And I encourage the panellists to talk to each other, and interjections are most welcome. We're going to talk about consumer trust, the FMA's conduct guidance, consumer insights from fiscal, which we're really looking forward to, domestic and international policy initiatives, the broader future of the sector, and the next big cab off the rank, of course, advice and advisors. Followed by some really quick-fire macro-level comments. We welcome texted questions from the floor as we go, but we'll try also to leave some question time at the end. So just to very briefly set the scene for what we hope will be a lively discussion with lots of interaction, the concept of good conduct and the need for a consumer-centric perspective, one that asks not just, is this lawful, but is this right? Yes, you did hear a lawyer say that. Is a key running theme of a recent commendably clear suite of FMA publications like its conduct guide and its statement of intent. And that emphasis reflects the overall framework of the FMC Act itself, which contemplates as overarching duties this sort of holy trinity of acting in investors' best interests, exercising the appropriate standard of care, and fair dealing. Performing specific issuer and supervisor obligations, maintaining fit-for-purpose governing documents, SIPOs, systems and processes is vital, but it is secondary to and is being tested against those overarching duties. The FMA wants to see evidence that providers have genuinely considered customer outcomes in their decision making, identified risks of poor customer outcomes, and actively considered the steps they should take to mitigate those risks. So they're telling us, don't tell us, show us. So I'm going to talk to DK Ireland, my friend. I'd like you to open with, if you can, on the topic, no doubt very usefully informed by your code work, of consumer trust in the sector. How, in your view, do we lift this, engage better, and ensure that the sector is seen as a more trusted partner in the New Zealand community? They're challenging open questions, I know, but in the words of Graham Norton, and don't worry, we don't have a big red chair, discuss.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mike. Trust, we hear, I guess, a lot about trust, improving trust, especially, I guess, with a certain quiz coming up in a couple of weeks that we all have to vote in and who we need to trust. But often the question or the issue that is put to people is you want to build trust, improve trust, we want consumers to have more trust, which is actually, I guess, a focus on the outcome or the vision, as opposed to where I think it should actually be, particularly now, is the focus on how do we actually get there, i.e. building trust or having consumers with increased trust is really no use if in fact that trust is not well placed. I think you just have to ask a certain cohort of purportedly wholesale investors who placed their trust in a gentleman by the name of David Ross to see how that played out. So I think the focus instead should shift to the trustworthiness of the sector and how do we improve the trustworthiness so that consumers can have confidence in being able to place trust in this sector. I think in that regard we have made some really great strides in the last few years in building an environment where that trust can be well placed through the licensing of fund managers that many of the people here have enjoyed over the last couple of years, as well as all restricted schemes having a professional licensed independent trustee on board. So you've got that governance level as something that people can genuinely have more trust in, I think, that greater level of quality assurance over it, coupled with the good work of the FMA that you mentioned before in terms of highlighting that focus on conduct. We're then about to see licensing of financial advice providers, again building up an environment where consumers can have more confidence that they can place the trust in this sector. The challenge for us, of course, is then, well, how do you communicate that through to consumers? Say, yes, we're a much more trustworthy bunch now, but you've then got to get back to the outcome of then translating that through. And I might just come on to that a bit later in the session, perhaps we talk on that. A last comment, I guess, just wanted to make now before we kick forward, is this thing about trust is we're all in this together, and I think really important for the people in this room in particular, with all the leaders of industry here, to actually collaborate, to work together and help each other build that trust and ensure that we are all adopting best practice, that then it's a universal thing. Because I think if there is another Ross Asset Management debacle, the trust hit impacts on all of us in terms of that loss of confidence. We all go back. So actually there is a vested interest in everyone in this room to work together to ensure that we're all sharing learnings and improving, raising the bar, just increasing that trustworthiness of us as a group, so we can all thrive together.
Thank you, David. That's superb scene setting, and we do collaborate even as a lawyers group. We get together, when we need to, and we talk about issues, and we make sure that we're just producing the best, most reasoned outcomes for our clients.
I have much trust and confidence in the quality of your whiskey, Mr. Woodbury. Yes.
Look, that segues really nicely into a question for Susan, actually. Susan, we're already seeing significantly more information coming through to MIS members, fund updates, PDSs, OMIs, new annual reports, and so on. In your view, are we starting to see better informed investors? Which is the point of the reforms, right? If not, are there better or additional methods of engagement that you would like to see from a consumer perspective? So what works and what doesn't? It could be early days. But
it's still very much early days, I think, Mike, and it's not just about better informed investors, it's also having more confident investors. And up to 24 hours ago, I think I would have said that, yes, I do think that the reforms and improvements have made a difference, but then I hear research saying that some people are reluctant to invest in KiwiSaver because they think that someone's going to take their money, they're not going to see it again. And then I think, wow, we've still got a long way to go. Just in terms of complaints, we see very few complaints against fund managers, superannuation schemes. So that would tend to suggest that consumers are well informed and understand the product, what they're getting into. But I would sound quite a big word of caution, and that is the fact that financial markets over recent years have been performing well. I think the proof of the pudding will be when and if we see another financial crisis, global crisis of some kind, that will cause the value of investment funds to fall rapidly. Experience shows, and I've been through a few of these in my time, both in my current, well, not in my current role, my previous role actually as Deputy Banking Ombudsman. As soon as investment fund values start to fall, then you'll see complaints. And that's when people will say, I didn't have sufficient information, I didn't receive suitable advice. The other thing is, I think we still do have an overuse of financial jargon, and we're certainly on the right way, I think, to improving that, and certainly the Workplace Savings Awards last night showed some real improvements, I think, and new ways of thinking in the way that we present information to consumers. Consumers have very short attention spans, so I think we constantly need to be looking at innovative ways to present information, for example, use of videos, social media, Real life stories, we find in our work that people really like hearing other people's stories. So if you can put a human face to the issue, it's a good way of selling your message. So I think we're on the right track, but there's definitely still improvements to be made.
Thanks very much, Susan. Liam, I'd like us to talk now, if we can, and with you in the lead, about the FMA's February 2017 guidance note, a guide to FMA's view of conduct. In practical terms, this signals how, given that conduct is at the heart of the new legislation, how the FMA will use conduct as its lens for looking at how providers behave when meeting their obligations, and importantly for shaping how the FMA interacts with those providers. The guidance is required reading. It sets out FMA's view of what good conduct is across 5 key areas it calls the 5 Cs: capability, conflict, culture, control, and communication. Could you give this audience, please, Liam, an overview as to what it is FMA is looking for in each of those areas, and perhaps, if we're fortunate enough, some anonymised examples of what not to do, as well as how we drive great?
We'll see how we go. Thanks, Mike. I mean, a couple of things first. This was our view of conduct. We put it out to meet a need that we'd really encountered as we went around the country and talked about our increasing focus on conduct rather than compliance. We really found that there were 2 audiences that we were speaking to. There were principally larger firms whose overseas group members had already encountered this conversation from other regulators and sometimes had been hit around the head and neck for their conduct. And we're already thinking about this, we're already taking steps to improve. And then we had a large number of firms who were not arguing with us, but were saying, well, we don't really see what that means and understand what you want from that. And that's what this guidance is meant to do, is just to set out how we think about conduct. So you can adopt 5 Cs, you can do it Australia's 3 Cs, whatever really works. But this is just one way to break down this rather large and slightly daunting topic into areas that are a little more easy to understand. So, I mean, capability is the first one, and this has been a big focus as we've come through licensing, with a lot of firms needing to come up to speed with a lot of new rules and ways of working. It's been a real challenge for small firms, and what's been quite good to see some innovative approaches. How do you build an ongoing and continuous capability building program within a very small firm? We've seen some that have put in place formal arrangements with business mentors and with other external parties to keep coming in, keeping them up to date with what's going on. And also use of independent directors and independence not only at board level but also perhaps on compliance committees, bringing in some of that specialist knowledge to boost particularly what a small firm might need. Some of the challenges that we've seen were all of the opposites of that. Firms that really had not taken the time to think about the New Zealand environment and the New Zealand rules, especially firms coming from overseas, and they've by and large been sent away to do more work, and that's really added to their licensing. Conflict is the second one, and this is really, along with imbalance of information and power, conflicts of interest is the heart of why regulators exist in the financial markets to a large extent. What we're looking for there is that firms can actively, they're working to identify, to manage conflicts of interest, or to avoid them. Now, the good examples we've seen are firms who have included thinking about conflicts of interest into the design process for new systems, new business processes, new products. It's so much easier to treat a conflict of interest before it's actually crystallised. At the point we're saying, here's our new offering now, what might be the risks of conflict that arise from there, finding ways to avoid or to manage right from the start. Something that I think is very important to get across in terms of our thinking about conflicts of interest now is that disclosure is simply not sufficient. Disclose and move on does not manage a conflict in many situations. And so we're expecting to see rather more active treatment. Culture, well, that's how we behave, and particularly how we behave when we think no one's looking. What we've been impressed with in some firms that we've seen have been the ones that have really put in place training and resources for frontline staff to identify vulnerable customers and to be able to put in place safeguards around them before you get too far down the track with them. Taking the time to assess whether the customer's experience of the service or the product was actually what you thought it was. So going well beyond customer satisfaction to trying to gauge exactly what did the customer get out of that. Was it what we thought we delivered? Was it what they thought they'd received? It's an area, though, that needs work. The number of cases that we've also seen where there just are not messages coming down from senior management around what is and is not tolerated at the front line, and that it needs to be something that is shown, and as my boss likes to say, it can't be put up on a poster. We've really got to compare what's on the posters to how people in the firm really see their leaders act, and that's how culture is growing. Control, the bottom line here is about information, and the poor practices we've seen. We saw it with when we looked at KiwiSaver advice a few years ago. In many cases, senior management could not tell us what sort of advice was being given at the front line. They simply didn't collect that sort of information. And from our point of view, we really don't see how you can influence and improve customer outcomes if you don't know what's going on in the first place, if you're only collecting data on sales and financial results. What we are seeing is that's good is firms that are putting in formal processes to assess trends in complaints. So not simply treating each symptom. I mean, that's a good start, that we've got a good complaints process, but then if we're using that to build intelligence, to adapt and improve procedures, and we're seeing firms that are starting to do that, and that's encouraging as well. Also, similar notion, firms that are using post-launch reviews of products and services, comparing how it's performed with how it was expected to, and particularly looking not only for products that underperform or perform differently, but products that overperform. So as we all know now, it could have been seen by a number of firms in the UK that payment protection insurance was earning far too much for the firms, far more than was expected. And that's because of the way it was being used at the front line. And it wasn't part of the design, but it could have been seen a lot earlier if people were thinking, is this product performing in an expected way, and not simply taking the good news and running with it. And lastly, communication. What we want here is, and it goes very much to what Susan was just talking about, communication is a two-way process. So first thing is firms that listen to customer needs and take the time to understand what the customers want are doing well. Those that are taking time to think about what the customer understands in the process, we like to see that. But it's an area that really is difficult to make progress on. In our recent survey of customer experiences of financial services, the two lowest results were the perception from customers that fees had been explained to them, and that the provider had taken time to help them understand why a product was suitable to them. And those are very much points about communication. What we'd love to get to is a notion that we're not talking disclosure, we are talking communication. We're using disclosure, using all the new information that's available for customers to start a conversation and to help customers to make better decisions. And we think we've still got quite a way to go in that one. So as we move from licensing the newly monitoring newly licensed firms to a more business as usual, we're going to have a continued increase in all of these areas, including in the selection of our thematic reviews over the next little while.
Thanks, Liam. I really liked your recent comments to the effect that conduct is particular to each business or person and their circumstances, and that a regulator cannot and should not prescribe how that happens. And there's quite an interesting divergence, isn't there, between New Zealand and Australia in that regard. APRA recently wrote to, just last month actually, to all registrable superannuation entities advising that some had weaknesses in terms of their operational governance practices, iterating those weaknesses and iterating what APRA wanted to see by way of introducing operational governance frameworks, policies and procedures to respond to those problems. So my question is, might we in due course expect more of the same from FMA, or will you adhere to the current more in principle and behavioural focus, whereby in its own words, FMA does not prescribe culture?
Yeah, there are a couple of things in that, Mike. One, I think, is as a general proposition, Australian law tends to be more prescriptive than ours. We tend to be a little more comfortable with levels of more principled regulation in New Zealand. Certainly, the second thing is an advantage that we feel we have coming slightly later than some other jurisdictions to looking at conduct within financial services firms, is that we can look around and learn from what others have done. And I really haven't today, and I'm not saying this is what APRA is doing, but I'm thinking more in the UK, attempts to prescribe culture to say we know what good culture looks like have not gone swimmingly well. And I don't think that is the way to grow a good culture, is to have it put upon you.
Yep.
It's got to come from within the firm. So, no, we want to maintain that. We will give guidance where there's a need for it. And that may come, we'll be looking at compliance assurance programs in the next little while, and we may give some more guidance there. But very much we're trying to keep a focus on outcomes rather than how to do it.
Thanks, Liam. I will get to the other gentleman, but I now want to turn back to Susan on the topic of the consumer's perspective. When we spoke earlier this week, you mentioned a 21% rise in inquiries and complaints addressed by Fiscal this year. That August was a record month for those, and that complaints are up across the board, albeit from a low base, and there's been a 70% rise in complaints against financial advisors this year. Now, I'm interested in your comments about whether conceivably that's sort of qualified good news, in the sense that it shows more awareness, perhaps by reason of the disclosures that we were talking about earlier, that you are here to help. But more particularly, what's working and what isn't, from the fiscal perspective and for providers' information?
Yes, Mike, well, you're right. We have had a big increase in complaints, and personally, I think that's a good thing. First of all, it shows probably that providers and advisors are getting better at recognising a complaint and then referring that on to us or the dispute resolution scheme. And it also shows, I think, that there is slowly consumer awareness is rising. Certainly, we've put quite a lot of resource into raising consumer awareness initiatives in the last 12 months. And I think it's a really good thing that the complaints are coming through to us, because we are the dispute resolution scheme, the specialist body there to deal with these complaints. And if people aren't complaining to us, then quite likely they're complaining to their family, friends, colleagues, and potentially hundreds of other people through the power of social media. So I think it's much better that the complaint is in with us. However, again, our internal research shows that there's still a lot of room for improvement. Only about 50% of the consumers who contact us have been referred by their provider. Otherwise, they've found out about us through Googling or being referred by, say, a Citizens Advice Bureau or a lawyer. And the role of the dispute resolution schemes is really important in raising consumer confidence and, in general, raising financial industry standards. And that's because our role is not just to resolve individual complaints, although obviously that is our core function, but also looking to see what lessons can be learned from the complaints that come before us, and then to tell people what lessons we've learned. Certainly, we're always looking also for trends and systemic issues which we can then pass on to the regulator to see if they need attention. All of our closed complaints, we always look to see what was the root cause analysis of that complaint, and we can then share that with our scheme participants through training and through case notes on our website, which are accessible to everybody. Back to complaints, we received very few complaints against fund managers, as I mentioned earlier, but we did see quite a large rise in complaints against financial advisors, and those were mostly those working in the area of personal risk. Common themes were consumers failing to disclose pre-existing medical conditions, consumers not understanding product features, the nature of what the product was going to cover, what it wasn't going to cover. We also see complaints about fees and commission clawbacks, and certainly sometimes in the disclosure documents we see there's considerable room for improvement in disclosure of fees. We often see fees buried in the small print, a lot of financial jargon, long paragraphs without headings, and it's not clearly signposted to the consumer. And coming back to one of Liam's points, a lot of the complaints we see stem from poor communication. Sometimes that might be a complete communication breakdown between the provider, advisor and their client. Sometimes it can be miscommunication where poorly worded documents, poorly worded communications have led to misunderstandings and then a complaint, which could have been avoided if the communication had been much better in the first place. And sometimes just an imbalance in expectations between the provider and the consumer. So, yeah, as I said, we're always looking for the lessons that can be learned and passing those on to industry and to consumers.
Well, thanks very much, Susan, particularly for teasing out those running themes. I think those are really, really useful. I've got a question for you. I was on the receiving end of the question. I'm not sure I entirely agree with the editorial slant, but I'm interested in your take on it. Do you think the proposal in the FSLAB that a DRS provider must notify FMA if it believes a market participant has or may have contravened or is likely to contravene any financial markets legislation in a material respect, could sometimes lead to a participant being less willing to, for want of a better expression, come to the party to acknowledge a shortcoming and put matters right in the consumer's best interests?
Yes, Mike. Well, at the moment, the duty is very widely worded, and I do have a concern about that because certainly when complaints come to us, we're always looking to try and reach an early resolution of the complaint. Obviously, that's usually in everybody's best interests, and sometimes and often we'll seek to settle a complaint by way of negotiation or perhaps a confidential conciliation where the parties are around the table. They reach a settlement that the consumer is happy with, and that also allows the advisor and often their professional indemnity insurer to reach a quick, efficient settlement and walk away and put the matter behind them. Now, there is a real danger, I think, that if the provider or advisor knows that we are going to be required to report on them to the FMA, the regulator, and that potentially they could be named and shamed, then there may be less willingness to come to the negotiation table and to crunch out a settlement. Yep. They may be wanting basically to defend their position to the last degree.
That's really useful. And you might like to comment on that, James, but I'll throw to you on the wider topic of domestic and international policy perspectives. We want to hear from you about the international perspective, UK, US and Australia, sort of recent and pending developments in this area, but also, and do feel free to kick off with this if you prefer, on Emmy's behalf, just can you give us something of an update on the recent and ongoing progress in terms of policy initiatives to improve investor engagement with KiwiSaver in areas such as new annual statements and fees disclosure?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll kick off with that first. We do have a pretty busy work program in central government, and just sort of probably building on some of the conversation we've had as well before. I'm actually quite conscious when we're not here to necessarily regulate culture and so forth as well. I know that the levers that central government are quite blunt, right? We pass laws, and laws aren't necessarily a great way of regulating culture, which is why we do rely on others in the system, such as fiscal, FMA, and of course industry to play a pretty crucial role in the conduct and culture piece. Just quickly running through some things that are on our work program at the moment. You mentioned the KiwiSaver work. KiwiSaver is just so important to all New Zealanders and to the integrity of the system as a whole. That's always going to be a pretty big focus for us. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of work around disclosure on KiwiSaver. The first tranche of that was around the dollar fees, which I'm very pleased will be coming in for next year's statements, and I think that will really help consumers understand what they're paying and the value that they're getting from providers. The second bit of that work, which is possibly a bit more tricky, I think, is around the projected retirement income assumptions. So I think one recurring theme this keeps popping up is that being able to visualise what you're going to be getting in your retirement really helps people to think about, am I saving enough? Can I be saving more? How's my savings tracking? Those kind of questions. It's a really nice prompt for people. So we're really keen to see that rolled out in due course. And I think as Minister Joyce mentioned yesterday, there was it's a bit tricky trying to figure out the underlying assumptions for those projections, but I don't think that's insurmountable by any means, and we'll be continuing to work with all of you on that over the coming months. Just some other bits and bobs on the go as well. FizzLab, we call it FizzLab, not FSLab. I think FSLab sounds like some kind of like brick type thing, or like a chocolate bar or something. FizzLab, that's a pretty significant piece of work, obviously, that's taking up most of my team's resource, and we'll do an ongoing basis. And that's a really crucial piece of legislation. We know that the current legislation, the FAA has had a whole series of unintended consequences. It's very complex. It needs improvement. So that's a really critical piece of work to really help. First of all, consumers have access to high quality advice, and also to help those in the industry with a hopefully more fit for purpose regulatory regime as well. FMC, of course, is always an ongoing focus for us. I think we're sort of well into it now, but there's always niggles popping up that we'll keep fixing over time, and we've got a pretty long list that we're working through there. And fintech, which has been a bit of a theme of this conference, is something that we are doing a lot of work on as well. MB's one of the founding members of the FinTech NZ working group, which is an industry working group which we're quite involved in, and we're doing a lot of thinking around the government's role in that space as well. So it's a pretty busy work program.
Yeah, would you have any objection to just racing through, or perhaps just skipping the overseas piece? We've got a really insightful question from the floor. I might ask you the question. Yeah,
do you want to do the question?
It's disappeared.
It's gone.
It was, from memory, employer super schemes used to place the trust in the super scheme provider, which from their perspective under the old model was of course the employer. Now they have to put their trust, and I guess the question is getting it having moved into a master trust setting in a provider that doesn't necessarily have the same common interests. Is this what the new legislation intended? It actually segues quite nicely in the question I have. But
yeah, that is a good question, and it does come down to it's quite a fundamental conduct question here around aligning incentives of those who manage your money and your own incentives as well. So I guess there are pretty strong duties in the FMC Act to make sure that there are people are acting in their best interests, and I'm sort of hopeful that employer schemes can still work with those providers to create a tailored experience for the employees. But obviously, if there are things people want to talk to us about, I'm very happy to have a chat about that.
there was quite an interesting, in fact remarkable piece of foray into this area for a conduct regulator. APRA last week, in fact just less than a week ago, wrote to all RSEs in Australia on the topic of assessing quality member outcomes, and I think it goes to the last question in a way, and the perceived insufficiency of simply complying with legislative and prudential obligations without giving due consideration to what they called quality outcomes for members. And against metrics which they listed like net returns, cost per member, operating costs, net cash flow ratio, etc., they concluded that where it's clear that a particular product is unlikely to be able to continue to operate in members' best interests, APRA expects the scheme provider to act to ensure a timely and well-managed transfer of members to another suitable product, either within its own operation or another's. Now, no doubt there's considerable force in the argument that we should be less doctrinaire here in New Zealand, and I'm interested in the panellists' perspectives. But with a member-centred lens on, we do now have some meaningful technical impediments to scheme aggregation. where that's considered desirable according to just such a set of metrics. Is MB open to a dialogue about bringing a bit of an 80-20 rule to bear on addressing those impediments?
Right, that was quite a long question, but coming to your sort of quite to your I think the gist of your question, which is around the legacy schemes and mergers. So I guess one point to make there was that during the FMC transition process, there was quite a window there that was pretty well signalled and pretty well explained. That the window did enable mergers to happen at that point. So obviously that window is now shut, and I think the mechanisms in the FMC Act that would allow mergers, they're much harder to make. I think there's investor choice and so forth. It's any change to the status quo now would require a legislative change, and that's not a simple thing to do. So, I without meaning to possibly pass off to Liam, it's possibly one that people need to talk to FMA about in the first instance. But we're very open to having dialogue along with FMA with people about particular situations to see if we can address any particular problems.
Okay, we'll move on. We'll make that a live issue, or unless you want to just speak.
Yeah,
briefly.
well, only absolutely people can come to talk to us, and we're always happy to. I mean, the starting point was there was the legacy window, and that's been done. And one of the things that we, just to go back to the earlier question, the FMC Act, to a large degree, it recognised the difference between the interests that are aligned in many of those employer schemes and opened that way through to legacy schemes. For those where you have a more arm's length ongoing relationship, that's one of the reasons we have the licensing, the governance and the other controls on place on that. So it does recognise that distinction.
What proportion, Susan, of complaints received by the DRS, your organisation, are due to provider faults or insufficiency, and is this proportion increasing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I probably don't have the numbers at my fingertips, and it depends also what you mean by provider faults, because that can be viewed very widely. I mean, just speaking generally, and this is complaints right across the board, not necessarily complaints against fund managers and financial advisors, probably about half the complaints are settled in favour of the consumer in some way, and that's not necessarily just a monetary settlement. It could be an explanation, an apology, and probably about half complaints are resolved not in the consumer's interest. I think that we are seeing probably a slight shift towards fewer complaints being upheld or settled in favour of the consumer compared to providers.
Okay. I'll turn to Richard now. What does the future of the sector look like? I wonder if you could just briefly talk to us on the topic of what your view of this is of what the sector looks like, with obviously KiwiSaver being the biggest growth driver. Obviously the key themes around saving, risk management and intermediation, but also please your take on other things like all the various KiwiSaver initiatives, sales transparency, sales practices, fee transparency, and the focus on consumer choice and comparability, the codes and conduct guides, which both the regulator and the peak industry body have had a lot to do with. What can we expect in the terms of the need to manage propriety risk in terms of incentive structures and conflicts management? And just conduct oversight in the insurance sector generally. Now, you knew this was coming, so go for your life.
Thank you, Mike. I just kind of take a step back, because if I start a consumer and go, what's the purpose of the people in this room? Like, what is it that we actually do and deliver? And I bring it back to what we said really through the whole conference, but the start of yesterday, and that is we help people manage their investments and their retirement and living too long bucket, and we also help them managing life's risks. And that's the insurance piece and dying too soon and so on. So if that's the purpose of our industry, then ultimately we've got to be a trusted sector and in many ways a partner to the New Zealand community in delivering products and services that are true to label, that deliver and so on. And that's kind of a work in progress. Having grown up and grown my career across the ditch and seeing everything from the start of the superannuation sector, going from a compulsory mandated 3% to now whatever it is, 9.5 or 11%, a massive system growth. I lived through FSR, financial services reform, and then the focus stuff. I lived through the life insurance framework. So that kind of perspective has been interesting, because I kind of applaud and commend the organisations and the people on this panel in the way in which they're conducting or we're conducting. How do we actually solve this problem? How do we get to a better place for consumers so that we're simpler and easier and more transparent and less conflicted and so on? So I think that kind of we're the work in progress in that regard. I think there's two tensions at play. One is at an industry level, and having come out of commercial entities, whenever there's regulatory change, it's kind of like the business just focuses on the burning platform. And in the Australian context, when there were issues that came up at Bay, and you just have to read some of the Aussie press over the last few weeks and months and days to see what's an institutional response when stuff happens and you just get absorbed on fighting the fire. Yeah. And so what that does is actually take your focus away really from, well, what's your purpose in your business? Because management's time is really focused on just fixing the problem. And the tension then is, on the other hand, actually you want to get to a better place. So how do we bring in regulation? How do we bring in codes? How do we make the operating environment better in a kind of organised and systemised way so people can actually get to that better place? And so I think that it is the tension between the organisations represented on this panel and in this room that kind of can get there. And, the FSC has an obligation, as does Workplace Savings, to actually take some of that responsibility ourselves. And in that regard, we've been working, certainly within the FSC context, on our own code of conduct, because you've got the FMC regime, you've got the code working group, you've got David's code group, technically the working group, and then you've got the industries working group that actually is all heading to the same point with slightly different lenses on the same topic. So I think collaboratively, absolutely we can get there. And I think the instructive pieces of what's happened internationally is some of what to do's, but also some of what to not do's. And to the last bit of the question, which is what's driving this marketplace, absolutely the demographics we've heard about all day, the disruption in technology we've heard about the last couple of days, and the literacy, financial awareness around KiwiSaver and engaging in your future and kind of broadening out the discussion, which I think is a challenge for all of us, that wealth just doesn't live in bricks and mortar. It's important to have a house and a roof over your head, and it's important to have a diversified portfolio. And so KiwiSaver in that regard is the great opportunity to drive the literacy discussion into how people think about money, how people think about wealth, how people think about the way they want to live their lives. And then the flip side of that is insurance, and maybe I'll comment on that later.
Thanks, Richard. We're actually getting a meaningful number of really good, really quite concrete questions. Another one for you, Susan. Oh, it's disappeared again. Can you give an example of a complaint upheld about replacing insurance where benefits were lost? How might the FSLAB help change process or conduct in this area?
Yes, well, typically the complaints in this area are where someone has had cover for a pre-existing medical condition under their previous life, health, income protection policy, and then when they move to a new policy, and perhaps they haven't declared that pre-existing medical condition, subsequently something happens, they make a claim and the claim is declined. So that's your typical complaint. Now the complaints, I might add, aren't always upheld. Sometimes it may be that the consumer has perhaps deliberately not disclosed or failed to disclose something that was material to the insurer. In terms of how the new law may help, well, obviously the requirement for all advisors to put the client's interests first, I think, will at least mean that they are turning their minds to really considering and hopefully explaining in detail to the customer why, if they're recommending in a replacement insurance policy, this is really going to be in the client's best interests. And in terms of the licensees who are going to be responsible for their advisors' behaviour, I think perhaps they'll be taking a lot more, I would hope, care to ensure that their advisors are doing a good job when it comes to properly comparing products, properly explaining the duty of disclosure to consumers because they don't understand it, and generally raising the professionalism of the advice given.
Mike, can I just, reinforce that point in terms of FizzLab, and when that comes in, with all financial advisors being subject to standards of professional conduct, in particular minimum standards of client care, in terms of looking at that replacement business, you've actually then finally got a proper regulatory framework for ensuring that the proper conversations are held and that the clients are actually looked after through that. FizzLab no longer has the word sort of client first sitting in it, so it's an interesting dynamic now for the Code Working Group as to how they're going to play that out in the client care obligations. But I think what you're then going to see is a much greater consistency for consumers when they're dealing with what are currently registered financial advisors dealing with the insurance replacement insurance proposition, that they will be subject to the same uniform level of standards of care. I think some insurance providers are actually doing quite a good job at that already. They've got packages and a clear set of processes you have to follow when you replace business. Unfortunately, that's not uniform across the entire sector of financial advisors actually applying that same approach, and we will see that consistency, at least from the regulatory framework, will then flow through. And if advisors don't follow through that, then you're going to have a much clearer point of recourse and much better defined options for FMA or disciplinary processes to take place to stamp on poor behaviours.
Got another question here. Do you see the current exemptions available to restricted schemes extending as further regulation, fees and projections as examples comes to pass? How do you balance the impact on trustees and the needs of consumers when determining this? I guess at granular level, that's getting at the fact that, for example, the pending changes requiring a bit more granularity in year-end reports are at the moment confined to retail KiwiSaver schemes, but there's sort of this question mark is the rest of the savings sector looking a bit of a work on in that regard? Can we expect a continued running theme of, I suppose, keeping up that acknowledgement that and we saw the statistics yesterday, the remaining restricted scheme sector, look, the schemes are well run, they are well regarded, they all have largely multinational, certainly sponsors with strong brands and with a strong sponsor covenant. Can we expect to be talking more of the same in terms of not over-regulating, over-prescribing the regulated environment that those schemes need to operate within?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Hope I've done it justice.
Yeah, I think as the question says, there was a balance to be struck here. So I guess, whenever we're doing any kind of regulation, we're doing a regulatory impact assessment. So we're thinking about things of like, what are the costs, what are the benefits, in particular. So we're doing that kind of cost-benefit analysis, and I guess to date in some of these analyses, we've thought, okay, look, the costs on restricted schemes, probably outweigh some of the benefits that those members might be getting. So it's that kind of analysis we'll keep doing, but it's definitely a kind of a issue-by-issue type analysis. I think there's no blanket rule, but we are very conscious of the impact of the cost of regulation on restricted schemes, and that's something we'll definitely keep in front of our mind as we go through these policy projects.
Thank you, and the questioner can be assured that we'll voice that perspective. We're running out of time, but just really briefly, David, lastly, back to you for a very brief overview, if we can, from the conduct and consumers perspective, again, on the very next tectonic shift in the landscape, which is the pending, obviously, introduction of significantly altered financial advisor obligations into the FMCA by way of a lift and shift and the repeal of the FAA. The personalised class distinction is going, the acronyms are changing, we all know how and why, improved and standardised disclosure and so on. But what are the key consumer-facing changes, just in summary terms? How effective will they be in your assessment and in ensuring that consumers get more advice? And how will the code and the working group drive those good outcomes?
So how long have we got, Mike?
7 minutes and 34 seconds.
Cool. Thanks, right. So the Potter version. Look, I've already, I guess, touched on it in that previous comment, hopefully much greater consistency in approach across the entire financial advice landscape with all financial advice brought within the same set of rules. So a levelling of the platform. It is. Sorry, I'm a regulated geek, right? So it's a fascinating time in terms of all this development and how it's going to roll out. I'm currently the Code Working Group. It's a blank sheet of paper, so expect consultation to commence or going to plan sort of next month, so we're starting to work through what's this actually going to look like, what are the changes going to be, what's then the impact going to be. Look, you look at the two new purposes for financial advice that are being brought into the FMC Act to improve availability and quality of financial advice. Question is there actually a competition or a conflict between those two? Is there a balancing, or can you actually achieve both? One of the real challenges, I think, for the Code Working Group will be actually ensuring that you do improve both, and that by driving an increase in quality, you then don't cut off availability, which has been recognised as a huge issue, and you do want to try and encourage financial advice being delivered, but how do you strike that? So the answer, of course, and this is a setup, isn't it? In terms of the answer, or the result is actually in the hands of the people here of actually engaging in that process and actually talking with the Code Working Group as they develop that, because you've already talked about it, I think, earlier today about New Zealand being quite unique in terms of our principled approach and being non-prescriptive, and a lot of it being driven by industry and engagement. So there is a big opportunity coming up to have that engagement and shape the way that financial advice is going to operate to deliver really good consumer outcomes. But the quality of the output will be dependent on the quality of the input from people in this group and wider. So that's, I guess, we don't want to call it a battleground, but there is a battle to be fought out, or sort of lots of engagement to work through to make sure we get to a good space that I think will then flow through, impact on, say, Susan's work of dispute resolution. It's going to change the shape of that. Hopefully, the end outcome, consumers should be able to have much greater confidence in the trustworthiness of the financial advice providers, sort of completing the chain.
Yep. Thanks very much, David. Richard, you were burning to comment.
It's kind of an interesting discussion because, again, there's a sense of how it's played out internationally. And, when you get regulatory change, people look at it either go, oh, my God, what are we going to do? And then there are others that go, actually, we want to get ahead of the curve and do a whole bunch of good stuff. And I can already see that starting to play out in New Zealand. And kind of the way it plays out, and prediction if you wish. But... advisors are savvy, entrepreneurial business owners. I mean, that's kind of how you get to be a good advisor. And so responding to the changes is kind of what they've just got to do. They've got to be good at that. And if you've been in business for a while, as some in this room have been, it's just a part of your skill set. And so multidisciplinary practices, fee-based models, a professional service firm that looks not too dissimilar from when you might go and talk to your lawyer or your engineer or your accountant, where you walk in and it's a professional setup and there's a fee base and you get diversity of services and you're dealing with professional and educated people. You can see those kind of businesses already coalescing together, and regulation in some ways drives that. But there are others that are already going on and taking the robo ideas and going, actually, you know what, we'll be a full service offer for some kind of clients, we'll do robo for some other kind of clients, we'll charge fee stuff. Oh, hey, there's a whole new world of technology and health and well-being, so we'll run some client seminars and help do that kind of stuff. And the advisor is the hub for the particular kind of client base that they're dealing with for a range of their financial needs and coaching needs is kind of alive and well around the world, and certainly happening here in New Zealand. And for me, I'm very optimistic about that. The thing that we just got to watch is that, and I was talking to John and Derek and Rod a little earlier, is that we actually bring people on that journey. Because there's a whole bunch of people who, when they saw the regulation, are going, well, tell me when it's ready and then I'll change or I'll make a decision. How we bring those people on the journey so that there's tension between access to advice and quality of advice doesn't end up being either price goes up and access goes down. And I think obviously that's one of the conundrums that collectively we kind of need to grapple with.
Yeah, the option taking here will be really, really interesting. And I know Susan's got a really interesting perspective on that, although we are out of road. Another really good question directed at Liam, at which point we will likely have run out of time. Does the FMA plan on being proactive in auditing advisors or providers to ensure legislation and conduct requirements are being followed? And are more resources, if so, are more resources being committed to this area?
Yeah, briefly, yes to both. So we were fortunate last year that there was a review of our funding. We got increased funding. We were one of the fortunate few on that one, and that was largely off the back of the changes in the FMC legislation. Now, a lot of the increased funding is going into my supervision area, and that is to deal with the new obligations to make sure that we're actively monitoring the new licensed population. How we do it will change from what we've seen in the past. So the population is much larger. There's going to be a smaller number of very intensive one-on-one monitoring engagements. There is certainly for the next year or so going to be a much greater emphasis on thematic work where we can be more targeted, touch a broader range of the population. We're signalling some of those in our annual corporate plan that we published last week.
Yes, thematic reviews of
Yep.
governing docs, SIPOs.
Governing documents,
Yeah.
SIPOs, wholesale investment management, there's a range. Have a read, it's a great doc. And the other thing I'll just mention, you become addicted to this countdown clock.
Yeah.
The other thing where we are applying funding is actually in protecting the newly licensed population. So a lot of people have put a lot of time and effort into coming to get a license, so some of the additional funding we're putting into proactively working on the perimeter of license to look at those who do not have a license but are potentially engaging in conduct for which they should be licensed. We feel we really owe that to the people who went to the bother of getting a license in the first place. So there'll be more activity on the perimeter as well as in the regulated core.
Thanks so much, Liam, and it just remains for me to thank everybody for their thoughtful and insightful comments to this group. It's been a really good level of engagement and energy. I've got 9 seconds and I'm determined to finish on time. David, Susan, James, Liam, and Richard, of course, thank you so much for contributing your insights. There's so much more we may have talked about, but there's never enough time. So thank you all, and do please feel free to, each and every one of these people is insightful, engaged, genuinely cares about what they do and cares about better outcomes, and they love being bailed up over coffee, so I'm giving you the license to do that. Thank you so much.